For those of you familiar with Israel, you know that while Israel has much social tension, we also know how to come together in a very powerful way. Stick with me as I break down a very surprising topic that is getting no attention at all, really, from anyone in the Jewish Israel world. After 2,000 years of exile, the Jewish people are once again gathered together in our ancestral, eternal, and biblical homeland. Whereas once we were 12 tribes living together in this land, today we are Jews who have returned from all four corners of the earth, joining those Jews who never left and were still here. Jews from India, Pakistan, Syria, Iraq, Poland, Germany, the United States, Ethiopia, and so many other countries are all living together again in Israel after being separated for thousands of years of exile. That is just bound to have an inherent social tension. Just as there is social tension in America or Canada, Britain, France, etc., due to an influx of immigrants from so many other countries around the world, so too in Israel, with Jews returning to our homeland from hundreds of countries after our exile. In exile for thousands of years, each Jewish community developed differently. Different customs, attitudes, social norms, dress, etc. And yet today we are all living together as part of the Jewish state Israeli society. On top of that, we have the tensions between religious and secular communities, between the political right and the political left, and of course the overall tension between proud Israeli citizens, including some Arab Israelis, and the fifth column of Arab Muslims who are Israeli citizens that support the ultimate destruction of the Jewish state of Israel. So yes, social tension is a part of life in Israel and something we will always have to navigate. It is never going to go away. Fast forward to today. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought about a whole new type of tension. A tension between those who support the government emergency COVID-19 restrictions in the name of public health on the one side, and a public on the other side that is vehemently against the authoritarian measures of government in the name of public health, which includes the coercion to get shots, a green vaccine passport that actually has just been rescinded here in Israel in most public places, and the overall overreach of government into our personal lives and life decisions. This is actually a tension that exists in many countries today, not just in Israel, because we're all dealing with this COVID-19. But here is the kicker. Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was the Prime Minister when the pandemic began. He led a right-wing religious coalition. It was that Netanyahu right-wing religious government that began passing the emergency laws that allowed the government to take away citizens' rights and freedoms in the name of public health. At the time, the left-wing parties in Israel were in the opposition, and they called Netanyahu a fascist for passing those laws. They were saying that his government was a fascist government destroying Israeli democracy, and even claiming that Israel was no longer a democracy due to the emergency COVID laws passed. Some of those leaders, including today's Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, were out in the streets protesting against Netanyahu and his government, sometimes in the thousands, openly flouting those regulations of social distancing, wearing masks, etc., that at the time they said they didn't believe in. The COVID-19 tension was developing into an anti-right-wing, anti-religious agenda item, and it was not pleasant. We already have enough tension dealing with real right-wing, left-wing political issues, religious, secular issues in our country. We don't need another issue to add to that tension, especially since it has nothing to do with right-wing or religious issues. It just happened to be that the government in power at the time was the right-wing religious Netanyahu government that initially passed those special emergency COVID laws that took away citizens' rights and freedoms and gave the government more power. And then the miracle happened. And I use the word miracle because it really is an amazing act of brilliance from God above that the Netanyahu right-wing religious government fell and was replaced by a government that included Prime Minister Bennett's right-wing Yamina party, together with the rainbow of leftist and Islamist parties from Israel's parliament. You see, once the leaders of the leftist human rights parties came to power, they also continued to approve those emergency COVID laws that just earlier they themselves called fascist and an end to Israeli democracy. So, while I'm not a fan of today's government, as I have explained in other videos, and I will explain in more videos, the existence of this right-left government today is a huge blessing in disguise because it neutered the extremely dangerous campaign that was developing, blaming the right-wing religious public for being anti-democratic fascists. Now, the whole Israeli public knows that the government management of COVID-19 has nothing to do with right-left religious secular issues. Everyone now knows that it's a governance issue. Can you imagine? The leftists who call themselves human rights political leaders, who were all against the fascist COVID laws when they were in the opposition, then supported those same laws once they got into power. Now, the other positive development of this crazy right-left government that we have today is that regardless if one agrees or disagrees, the public freedom movement in Israel has united so many people from the various sectors of Israeli society. Whereas before there was little communication or collaboration between right, left, religious, secular, this freedom movement is uniting us all. Personally, it is beautiful to see WhatsApp messages from secular and ultra-Orthodox in the same WhatsApp group, and then messages with wishes of Shabbat Shalom, or requests being made not to have messages be sent during the Shabbat, but that everyone's looking forward to seeing each other at protests after Shabbat. Again, regardless of where one stands on this issue or on this right-left government, the fact that the COVID tension can no longer be used as a political issue against the right-wing religious community in Israel is huge. And the process of unity taking place in this freedom movement in Israel is a wonderful and beautiful thing to see and witness. As we learn in Judaism, we always make blessings to thank God for everything, even on bad things. Why? Because ultimately we, man, do not understand God's plans. And while we might think or even know when something is bad, it is really just one small part of a greater plan from God above that we have no clue about, but that ultimately God knows is for the good. And for that, we still have to say thank you, even for the bad things.
Pulse of Israel, frontline videos from the Holy Land. Support our work by donating today.